This is my 160th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part will be another rolling stock kit build, ending with some running video. I'll be building 2 Slater's kits for private owner 6-plank open wagons. These kits come with pre-printed private owner markings. When the kits are built, I'll be running them in a little train together with a Hornby 3-pack of private owner open wagons and an Airfix GMR LMS brake van drawn by a Bachmann Midland 1F loco with open cab. The Hornby 003 rail stuff that I previewed in my previous video is coming, and I'm very excited about it and honestly a little bit stressed. But I've been building these Slater's kits between other things over the last couple of weeks, so now that they're done I wanted to feature the builds in a video. Clock's still chiming. These are the 2 Slater's kits. I picked them up locally here in Canada from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario. Slater's current price for these kits, including VAT for UK sale, is £9.50p. The kits don't include wheels or couplings, or indeed any form of coupling mount. Knowing this, I bought suitable wheels at the same time that I bought the kits, Market's 12mm 10-spoke wheels with 26mm pinpoint axles. The kits also don't include axle bearings, but I had bearings on hand, as well as couplings and coupling mounts. The rather intriguing thing about these kits is that the outside of the parts for the wagon's sides and ends is finished with full private owner markings on the sides. Here's what I got when I opened the first kit. 4 sprues of parts moulded from grey plastic, with the 2 sprues for the wagon sides and ends pre-painted and detailed. A wagon base as a separate part, a small bag containing metal buffer heads and some other little bits of metal, and a sheet of Methfix transfers. There was also an instruction sheet printed on one side only. Bits of the text were crossed out, indicating that when the sheet was first printed, the kits came with couplings, although they don't now. The instructions were fairly straightforward. I turned my attention to the issue of fitting couplings before starting assembly of the kit, as some modification of parts was likely to be required. I got out a couple of Bachmann wide couplings, which are the type I've generally been fitting when building kits. Together with these, I got out 2 Pico coupling mounting blocks onto which the Bachmann couplings will fit nicely. I needed to modify the base of the wagon to allow for fitting the Pico coupling mounts. The ribs that went to the ends of the base would need to be cut back so that the coupling blocks could be fitted flush to the floor at the ends. This would obviously be much easier to do before mounting the floor to the wagon. I tried to mark how far back the ribs needed to be cut. The kit intended the ends of the wagon to fit flush against the ribs, but I needed a gap between the wagon end and the ribs into which my coupling mount would go. Having marked how far back the gap needed to go as best as I could, I cut back the ribs with a sharp knife. The plastic from which these kits were made was of the soapy type, so cutting it wasn't difficult. The parts for the wagon's sides were nicely pre-marked. Unfortunately, they were connected to the sprue by multiple points along the top, meaning that when the parts were cut from the sprue, a bunch of blemishes in the paintwork at the top were very noticeable. Assembly commenced with gluing together the wagon sides and ends at their corner bevels. I used slightly viscous liquid polycement with a fine metal tube applicator for all of the assembly. The 4 sides of the wagon were glued together at their mitered corners. The sides did tend to warp somewhat, but when the floor is mounted that should correct. Since it will sit on ribs at the bottom of the ends, the floor needs to be put into place from the top. It was a little fiddly getting the floor into place past the warped sides, but it did fit and sit down nicely once it was in. Next, the sole bars needed to be done. They needed to be cut from the sprues carefully to avoid damaging them, though at least the plastic was of the less brittle type, making breakage a little bit less of a threat. Once they were separated from the sprues, I cleaned up the sole bars with clippers and an emery board. The tops of the sole bars needed to be made very flat, as they would fit against the base of the wagon and support the axles. As mentioned, the kit didn't include bearings for the ends of the axles. Axles with pinpoint ends will run best if the ends are held in suitable brass bearings. I had some bearings on hand that I thought would be suitable. I got out 4 of these bearings for the wagon. The fit of the bearings in the holes in the axle boxes wasn't tight enough for them to be just push-fitted, so I glued the bearings into the axle boxes using the tip of a toothpick to apply CA glue into the holes. I left the sole bars for a while to allow the CA glue to set thoroughly. I used a red marker to touch up the tops of the wagon sides where the sprue attachment points had left multiple places without paint. There was a small part for the hinge of the wagon end door. I wasn't really clear how this part was supposed to fit, and the instructions were really no help as the exploded diagram didn't include this part at all. I'm still not sure if it was supposed to go at the top as seen here or at the bottom, but the top seemed more likely to me. It was quite clear which end of the wagon had the door. I touched up the hinge part with a red marker also. The sole bars fitted to the base of the wagon up against the ribs. I wanted to fit the axles between the sole bars before the glue holding the sole bars fully set. But I've learnt from experience that you can never really trust wheels that you buy to be properly gauged. So I gauged the wheels on both axles before fitting them. I went for a little over 14mm, as I find this seems to be a fairly good compromise. They were more up towards 15mm when they started. I mounted the axles between the bearings in the axle boxes, ensuring that the wheels pivoted freely. This was fairly fiddly to do and required a bit of jiggering around with the sole bars. Next, I glued handbrake levers to the outside of the sole bars. The instructions said that when first built, these wagons would have had brakes on only one side, but brake parts for both sides were supplied. I decided to go with brakes on both sides, as was later introduced for better safety and ease of operation. Next, the brake shoes themselves needed to be fitted. I did my best to clean up the parts after separating them from the sprues. Fitting these parts was especially tricky. They needed to fit between the ribs, and they were a bit too wide as they came, so they needed to be sanded down so that they would go in at all. Then they needed to be fitted carefully so that they looked reasonably close to the wheels but didn't actually touch the wheels and stop them rotating freely. Next, I fitted my coupling mounting blocks and couplings. There was very little space, so a bit of finagling was required to fit the couplings without them touching the wheels. The final parts to be fitted were the details for the buffer beams. I cut the small parts for the coupling hooks from the sprues, taking care not to break or lose them, both of which I've done with small parts like this in the past. The holes where the coupling hooks were supposed to fit weren't really open, so I had to use the tip of a knife to try to open out those holes before fitting the hooks. I used pliers to hold the hooks firmly and force them into the holes. I knew from experience that this would work best. Trying to do this with tweezers is hopeless, as you just can't get a firm enough hold on the little part. I got the metal buffer heads out from the bag they came in. There were some little bits of metal in the bag along with the buffer heads, and I was puzzled as to whether these were supposed to be parts of some kind, and if so, what they could be. I eventually concluded that they were just random bits of metallic garbage. Little plastic rings needed to be cut from the sprues and then fitted to the stems of the metal buffer heads. This was pretty fiddly to do. I just pressed a finger onto one of the plastic rings, then when it stuck to the head of my finger, I held the buffer head in tweezers and tried to press its stem into the little ring on the tip of my finger. Even doing it that way, it took a few tries in some cases. The fittings for the buffers on the wagon ends were painted over, so I sanded them before fitting the buffers so that the rings would stick to the fittings. I fitted the buffer heads into the holes in the fittings with the rings glued to the fittings. I wasn't too sure whether these buffers would allow the wagon to operate properly. Two wagons coupled together must be able to turn relative to each other so that the train can get around curves. Trying these buffers with a ready-to-run model that I had on my bench, it seemed that they might be okay. I wasn't at all clear why this sheet of Airfix decals was supplied with the kit. It turned out that the other kit came with no such decal sheet, so I'm thinking that it was perhaps just included in error. I'm not very fond of Airfix decals. They work okay, but they're considerably more trouble to work with than either press-fix or water-slide decals. Anyway, in this case I didn't do anything with these decals. Here's the second kit. I will go through the build, but I'll try not to repeat what I've already covered with the first kit. Same parts and exactly the same instructions. The only difference was the finishing of the paintwork and the omission of a decal sheet. Exact same instruction sheet, just a bit more scribbled on in this case. The sides and ends were made of dark brown plastic in this case, with black paintwork. The part for the end hinge came completely malformed. Honestly, I felt that this was completely unacceptable. Decent quality control should have caught this improperly moulded sprue and discarded it rather than finishing it, packing it and shipping it to a retailer. I went ahead with the same process as before, getting out couplings and coupling mounting blocks. I cut down the ends of the ribs on the base to fit the coupling mounting blocks. All four sides were glued together after the mitered ends were cleaned up. Then the floor was inserted from the top. The sole bars cut from the sprues and cleaned up. Brass bearings glued into the axle boxes with CA. Wheels gauged. I did my best to try to repair this malformed hinge part by gluing a tiny piece of 20 thou styrene rod into the gap and then letting that set before cutting the part from the sprue. Then I painted my repair black. I didn't dare try to sand it as it was so delicate. I glued the part into the end of the wagon, not terribly satisfactory. I fitted the sole bars and the wheels. Then I fitted my coupling mounting blocks and couplings. There was so little space that I had to cut out the backs of the couplings a bit to stop them touching the wheels. Had to do that at both ends, but by doing that I was able to get the couplings mounted while still allowing the wheels to turn freely. Again, I cleaned up the parts for the brake shoes. I had more trouble getting them to fit on this kit. On one side, I just couldn't get the brake shoes to fit without touching the wheel at one end, so I glued a little piece of plastic to one end of the base of the shoe part to force it to mount at a bit of an angle, so clearing the wheel. Here's that part mounted. The left end is pushed out from the rib so that the left shoe won't touch the wheel. It shouldn't be noticeable that the shoes aren't straight when the wagon is running. Next, the handbrake operating levers were glued to the sides. Then the coupling hooks were fitted as before. The little rings for the buffer heads cut out. In this case, the buffer heads themselves had stems with ends that weren't properly formed, so I cut off excess metal with clippers and then cleaned up with a file. I sanded the fittings for the buffers on the wagon ends and fitted the buffer heads. When I tried the two kit-built wagons together, it appeared that they really weren't going to be able to turn enough to get round curves because of the buffers locking. So I took all of the buffer heads back off, cut down the stems with side cutters and refitted them to make them shorter. Now I felt that the wagons should be able to get round curves okay. Those fairly short Bachmann couplings just won't work with long buffers. Next, I painted the lower parts, etc. black. I really don't know why they didn't just use black plastic, since basically all of the parts on the sprues needed to be black. It would have made things a lot easier. Given that the parts were very far from flat, I had to apply a lot of paint to manage to get it into all the little crevices, etc. And I got some on the wheels. I wasn't too sure what to do about the interior of the wagons. I decided to try to apply some dark brown paint. This may not have been the best idea. The cheap dollar store paint didn't cover at all well, but it was the only really dark brown that I had on hand. Here are the finished wagons on the track of my Hornby layout. I might end up doing something more to improve the interiors, perhaps even putting loads into them. I got out some other recently acquired rolling stock to run with these wagons. This is an Airfix brake van that I picked up on eBay. Nothing too fancy, but it's really quite nicely finished. Those handrails are probably better done than I could manage. I bought this Hornby set of 3 weathered wagons locally. Here's the back indicating the actual contents. I guess David was a previous owner. The wagons came in their separate boxes within the outer sleeve. And here are those wagons unpacked. The weathering is pretty subtle. In fact, I don't know that I'd noticed that they were weathered, except perhaps for the wheels. I coupled up all of the wagons behind my little Bachmann Midland 1F with the open cab. With the open cab and the weathering and detailing, I think this is one of the nicest looking locos that I have, so it gets run quite often. There are the wagons built from the Slater's kits between 2 of the Hornby wagons. And here's the front of that little train with the 1F loco. So now I'll try to finish with some running video of this little train. Okay, let me just see if I can do a little bit of running with these 2 wagons built from the Slater's kits. There's the Slater's wagons, Princess Royal Colliery and Thomas Pascoe Swansea, coals and anthracite or something. And then we've got, that's one of the Hornby wagons. I can't read it in the viewfinder, something quarry granite. And there we got the crew in the little Midland 1F loco with yeah, it's quite nice. You can see the controls in the open cab and the tools and the detailing and whatever. That's quite nice. Most of that I didn't do. It was actually professionally weathered by the model centre. I added one of the crew figures because there was only one man on the footplate when I got it. And what have we got behind? We got a couple more wagons from the Hornby set, Dutton Massey something, and Thread Gold. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read through the viewfinder, which I can't do very well. And then the LMS brake van from Airfix, Great Model Railways, on the back. Okay, so let's see if I can start this little train off. freight train, so we don't want too much speed. That's 40% power. That, if it'll run round like that, that seems to me about an appropriate freight speed. Freight trains, I don't think freight trains really went much faster than that, but they often went slower than that. There's those. Yep, that seems to me even actually a little bit fast, probably, for a freight train. I'm trying to just edge the speed down just a little bit, but we don't want it to go so slow that it stalls if there's any little obstruction or whatever. I don't think this engine has trouble going over the points, even though it's a fairly short engine. I think it has pickups on all of its wheels. And, well, we'll see. This is where it's coming up to the points here. No, I didn't really think I really saw a hesitation there. I probably should do something different to the interior of the wagons, although just random dirtiness isn't terribly unreasonable for the interior of a wagon. Oh dear, my back is in worse than usual shape today. I'm trying to kneel down so I can give you a more track level perspective of the train going by, but my back is really not in a friendly mood today, so I'm going to stay down for one more time. See, couldn't even tell whether that was in focus anyway. I'll stay down for one more time, then I'll see if I can come back up. Yeah, my back problems are all worse than usual today. So there we go. Do like that little Midland 1F loco. And Bachmann released it long enough ago that its price was fairly reasonable. When they reduced the 1P, the Midland 1P, a few years later, its price was about 40% more, just because things had gone up over the years. And still now the 1P sells for a lot more than this 1F, although I wouldn't say it's really particularly a better model. Yeah, the crimson, in the crimson livery, it looks fancy. But anyway, let's slow down and stop there just before the signal, and there we go. So, other than the fact that their interiors could probably be done a little bit nicer, I don't know whether I'm going to put loads in them. It makes sense to have some empty wagons. I've got a lot of wagons with loads in. We'll see. For now, this whole train ran with empty wagons. So there they are, the two private owner wagons from Slater's kits.